Hello and welcome everybody to Edward and Wallis. To prepare for this event, I read this book, uh, The Secret Life of the Duchess of Windsor, written by Charles Hyam, who was an aristocrat, he was a child when the abdication happened. And actually, in my research, from what I found, he he's known as the king who abdicated for love. He didn't actually abdicate, he was deposed. He was forced from the throne. He just didn't know about the things that were happening behind the scenes to get him out of power. And we know this because in 1927, and this is before he met Wallis, because he met Wallis in 1931. So in 1927, before he ever met Wallis, he was playing polo, and he was undertaking a point-to-point during the polo match. And while it was happening, the prime minister at the time, Stanley Baldwin, was having a very curious conversation with Edward's equerry at the time, a man named Tommy Lascelles. They had a very telling exchange. So Tommy turned to the prime minister and said, quote, "I often think, sir, that the best thing that could happen when we're waiting to get the results of this race would be to hear that the Prince of Wales had fallen and broken his neck." To which the Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin, responded, "God forgive me, so do I." So even though Wallis is blamed for, getting Edward off the throne, she was just a convenient scapegoat. And now we're going to get into the story of Edward and Wallis. So first of all, let's talk about Edward's personality. So he's described as an extremely charming person. He was said to have a wonderful sense of humor. He mixed with people very easily, even people from the lower classes. He loved life and he liked to have fun. And particularly during the roaring 20s, he liked to drink beer and play darts. He was more himself when hanging out with, more common people. He loved having a laugh. He was very, very attractive, very, very stylish, very vain, and very playful. In fact, when he became king, he broke tradition because when you're a king of or queen of England and you ascend to the throne, they mint a special coin for you, and they alternate, left side, right side profile. And in Edward's case, it was supposed to be the right side, but he insisted that they do the left side so that he could show off the parting of his hair. It was very vain. Anyway, people around him, he was very, very playful, but people around him never got too familiar. He was still a future king. He was very aware of his position, but he loved being informal. He enjoyed gardening, pruning flowers, digging holes, playing golf. And he loved having his friends over to his home at the castle, Fort Belvedere, for the weekend. And they would be very, very informal with him. There was a time when celebrating his birthday when he was expected to have dinner with his parents, which he saw as a duty. And at that time, King Alfonso of Spain was visiting England and staying at the home of some of Edward's friends. And he told them that he wanted to spend his birthday with them, but duty called and he had to have dinner with his parents. So the dinner with his parents went very late. His friends had all gone to bed, and they were, in their sleeping gowns in bed when in the middle of the night, Edward's car drove into their front yard, and he grabbed a bottle of champagne and came into the house. He went up to their bedroom and sat in their bed with them. They were all dressed informally in their pajamas. And then even King Alfonso of Spain came into the bedroom and they all sat there and had a pajama party. And that was his idea of a fun birthday party. And Edward, Wallis always called him David because that's what his family called him. He was born and grew up at Sandringham. He was born on June 23rd, 1894. His full name was Edward Albert Christian George Patrick Andrew David. We called him David. His parents were, of course, King George and Queen Mary. His parents were very distant, very, very traditional, cold, cruel. He was spoiled by his grandfather. And the family was actually German, so he spoke very, very fluent German. He was flawless. His parents were very aloof, distant, cold, and stiff. So the siblings, they were very, very close to each other because that's the only love they got in their childhood. He left for boarding school at the Naval Academy when he was 12 years old on the Isle of Wight. Then he moved to Dartmouth Naval Academy. He was not very bright, and fellow cadets respected him because he refused to receive any special treatment when he was at Dartmouth. In 1910, his grandfather, who was considered the uncle of Europe, died, and Edward's father, of course, became King George, and Edward became heir to the throne. He was invested as Prince of Wales on July 13, 1911, in the presence of 10,000 guests. And he was wearing a costume or outfit that he referred to as this preposterous rig. The naval cadets mocked him over the satin stockings that he wore during the ceremony when he was getting invested as Prince of Wales. And his father crowned him, with a crown of pearls and a studded coronet, because pearls were very much the emblem of royalty. And he felt very unsettled from this time on because now he was expected to always conduct himself and carry out rules befitting of the heir to the throne. And in fact, during his first royal duties, first solo engagement, he was trembling like a leaf. And he delivered his first public speech. He had hoped to have a career at sea with the rest of the Navy cadets, who were many of his friends, but he wasn't allowed to as heir to the throne. He was sent off to Oxford University, where he floundered badly. He was out of his depth. And while he was there, he found a new hobby, which was girls. And so he would take girls rowing on the river, and he'd be finding ways to amuse them. I'm going to share my screen to show a picture of what he looked like at this time. He was very, very good looking. Anyway, he left Oxford in 1914 without graduating. And later that summer, a war broke out between England and Germany. And lots of people were eagerly signing up for the war, expecting that it would be over by that Christmas. And even he was eager to join. He wanted to go to war, but of course he was heir to the throne. He wasn't allowed to. And he was allowed to visit the British troops in France, but not to go to the front or, to see the action. But his visit raised morale basically among the troops. He was very, very envious of his younger brother, Albert, known as Bertie, who was allowed to see action up close. And Bertie was commander of a gun crew. He did it with distinction and he got honorable mention. Edward was very, very jealous. He eventually got to see part of the war because he was at the Somme, and Edward, that is, he saw how the men were injured during the Battle of the Somme, where 60,000 British soldiers were killed within one day. And he was deeply affected by it. And anti-German sentiment was running very high in London at this time. German shops were being vandalized. And so his father, King George, decided to change the family's German name of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha to Windsor, named after the Windsor Castle. Of course, Germany surrendered in late 1918. And with the end of the war, it was time for Edward to get back into his old hobby of womanizing. It all started with a French prostitute named Paulette, whom his equerries had arranged for him. And then after that, with a Parisian courtesan named Marguerite. Marguerite would go on to make headlines in the future by murdering her Egyptian playboy husband. But we're going to talk about the women that had a very huge impact on Edward's life. So the first among these was a woman named Frida Dudley Ward. That's her. She was born Winifred Birkin in 1894, and she and Edward were together for 15 years. He was absolutely smitten with her. She had a very, very powerful hold over him and wielded the authority of a dominatrix over him. And she was also his most trusted confidant. He was completely devoted to her, repeatedly begged her to marry him, wrote her numerous letters where he used baby talk. He was a very, very childish person. Um, he often referred to her as his precious, darling little mummy. And he kept begging her to punish him. There was just one tiny problem with, this begging her to marry him. Frida was married. Not only was she married, she had two daughters, and she was carrying on multiple affairs with other men, actually. And yet her hold on him was so powerful that he was willing to abdicate for her. This is before Wallis. So they had actually met in 1918 when Frida got caught in a rainstorm in Belgravia, and she took shelter in the doorway of a mansion in Belgrave Square. And there was a party taking place inside, and Edward was a guest at that party. And the hostess saw Frida, taking shelter on her front steps, and invited Frida to join the party. And Edward saw her, and he was instantly captivated by her. She had a vulnerability about her that made men want to look after her. But she was actually a very, very strong person. She knew how to build up men's egos, and she was exactly the sort of person that Edward was looking for, because he was actually very, very insecure. She came from a kind of poor family because her father was a lace maker. She had no aristocratic ties. She was married to a member of parliament, and her daughters Penelope and Angie got along very, very well with Edward. They were very, very discreet, but they managed to see each other every day. And if this couldn't happen, Edward would call her incessantly, 4 to 5 times a night, even though she was married. He called her Freedy Mummy. And throughout the 1920s, when he was sent on tour to various colonies, he would bombard his angel with letters, and he signed them Your E. He carried her picture with him everywhere he went, which he kept in a leather frame by his bed. And he was known that he would stare at it for hours and kiss it all the time. And even while he was a Tory, even though he had affairs with multiple women during his tours, he remained devoted to her. And he would tell her in letters, quote, "Thinking of you makes me feel fearfully naughty." She was clearly very, very attractive, but I mean, so are countless other women. The draw for Edward was that she was the grown-up in the relationship. And also she was married. And so, if she happened to get pregnant, it wouldn't cause a huge scandal. He had a thing for married women. All his affairs were with married women. And he also loved very dominant women who talked down to him and who were irreverent. Because I guess, he was born royal, and then he was heir to the throne, and everybody deferred to him. Everybody around him was a yes man. And so he loved women who were rude to him. He enjoyed it. And he even told her in one letter, you ought to be really foul to me sometimes, sweetie, and curse and be cruel. It will do me worlds of good and bring me to my right senses. In another letter, he invited her to, quote, "Come up to London and give me that hiding." And he said, "I do need you so badly to chase me into bed with a big stick." He loved dominant women. It was what he liked. He complained to her about how stifling and constraining royal life was, and how much he hated royal duties, and how he hated princing, and he didn't want to be king. Everyone expected so much of him, and he just didn't feel equal to the task. He just wanted to be an ordinary person. But she told him that it was absurd. He could never be an ordinary person. He was going to be a king. He was born to be king. And he told her, "All I want is to be with you always, and it will break my heart if you stop loving me. told her he will just nip off with her to anywhere in the world if she would just make up her mind to divorce her husband. And she said it was ridiculous. His parents would never allow it. They'll never allow him to marry a divorced American woman. They carried on their relationship. They went out dancing a lot to clubs all over London. They even took dance lessons together when the Charleston was all the rage. Frida's husband knew all about the affair, but he accepted it and he kept away because he benefited from it too. Because his business dealings, everybody knew his wife was having an affair with the future king. It was good for business. Edward even doted on her children, and he would sit with them for hours. They called him the Little Prince. He would sit with them for hours, cutting out pictures and making scrapbooks until their bedtime. Their affair was kept very, very secret, and his parents were horrified when they found out about it. And of course, they used to refer to her as, quote, the lace maker's daughter. And then people began to gossip about Frida, and she tried to leave because it was becoming a huge scandal. And he tried to make her stay, but it was getting out of hand. And the paparazzi, yes, the paparazzi at that time, they just dressed better. That's what the paparazzi looked like back then. And she was prepared to leave her husband, but for one of the bankers that she was seeing, a man named Michael Herbert. She had additional affairs, and so did Edward. Then remember that he had an affair with Frida's sister as well. In 1926, Edward met a twice divorced American woman. No, not Wallis Simpson, but Thelma Furness, and began an intense affair with her as well. Frida was still his mother confessor, and her relationship was just basically physical with Thelma. But fast forward to June 1930, Frida divorced her husband because he had an affair. How ironic. And then by this time, Michael, the banker that she adored, had died from bronchial pneumonia. And she was devastated, but at least now she was free to run off with Edward if he wanted. But it was too late because now he was deeply involved with Thelma Furness. And of course, Thelma would eventually introduce Edward to Wallis Simpson. And so, how did he break up with Frida? She hadn't heard from Edward for a few weeks, and so she phoned him at St. James Palace to talk to him. And she was told, quote, I have orders not to put you through. He was brutal in the way he cast her aside, and they never spoke again. And now his affair with Thelma Furness. Now, Thelma she lived a very, very colorful life even before she met Edward. She was a twin. So that's a picture of Thelma and her twin sister, whom you may know as Gloria Vanderbilt. Americans will know her as Anderson Cooper's grandmother, Anderson Cooper of CNN, of course. So she had divorced her first husband, a very, very wealthy man. She and her twin sister, they'd been raised to marry money. Their mom had trained them to marry real money, and they both did. So she met her second husband, a British aristocrat named Marmaduke Furness, and she married him in 1926 on June 27th. And then the day after her wedding was when she met Edward. But they wouldn't meet again until 1929 when they'll begin their affair. And by this time, 1929, when they met again, her husband Marmaduke was fooling around on Thelma. And Thelma was contemplating divorce. But the women in her circle in London told her that we don't get divorced, we have affairs. And then conveniently, she bumped into the Prince of Wales again around the time. And he remembered her and invited her to dinner and to dancing, and they began their affair. They would spend weekends together, and even her father would hang out with them at Edward's home. And he was smitten with her. So he wanted her to get divorced, and he would abdicate for her as well. But she didn't want to, because she was married to an aristocrat, and so she had real respect for the aristocracy and the royal family. Then around 1930 or 1931, Thelma made a new friend named Wallis Simpson. They got along wonderfully, and she introduced said friend to her paramour. And her husband tried to reconcile with her around this time, but the marriage just couldn't work. She thought it was impossible to marry Edward, and she was content to just be his girlfriend. And in 1934, when her twin sister Gloria Vanderbilt was in the middle of a custody battle for her daughter, she invited Thelma back to the US for a 6-week stay. And Thelma asked her dear friend Wallis to take good care of her friend and keep an eye on him. And Wallis sure did. And when she returned to England after her 6-week stay in America, she'd been deposed. Now let's move on to Wallis. All right, that's a paparazzi again. That's Wallis. Now, Wallis came from a very prominent Baltimore family that had connections with J.P. Morgan, as well as having substantial holdings in the railways and in banking. Her father, Tickle Warfield, was considered a weakling by the rest of his family because he had tuberculosis. He was treated like an outcast by the family. And at that time, people who had tuberculosis were not allowed to get married. They were expected to stay celibate and not to reproduce. Well, Tickle did anyway. He got into a secret relationship with a woman named Alice Montague, and she got pregnant out of wedlock. And for prominent Baltimore families, that was a nightmare. Families were horrified. So we bundled up Tickle and Alice and sent them up into the mountains in Pennsylvania, on the Pennsylvania Maryland border, where Alice was expected to stay indoors until the baby was born. And so Bessie Wallis Warfield was born in the mountains there on June 19th, 1895. And she was actually born intersex or hermaphrodite. She was male and female. And because of the shame of, being born out of wedlock, her family didn't announce her birth, and she wasn't even allowed to get baptized. Like in the future, when she was getting married, they had to create fake baptismal certificates. Her parents got married 17 months after her birth, but the family just never really accepted them. It was just too shameful. Wallis was born a snob. Even as a small child, she named her dolls Mrs. Astor, which was the wife of the richest man in the world. Of course, the Astor who died on the Titanic, the richest man on the Titanic. And then her other doll was named Mrs. Vanderbilt, the reigning queen of New York society. Her first word was Mimi. And even as a toddler, she read fashion magazines and read about royalty. Her wealthy relatives always reminded her and her mother that they were just charity cases to the rest of the family. And even though her mom was actually poor, Wallis behaved imperiously, and she was very proud, very, very stubborn. Even as a child, you could not make her feel poor, no matter how you tried. She always felt insecure about being born intersex, so she went out of her way to always be extra feminine, and she groomed herself impeccably. Her father died, and her mom remarried against Wallis's wishes, and she threw a tantrum at the marriage, actually destroyed the wedding cake during the wedding reception. As a teenager, her favorite things were boys and, quote, the taste, the smell, and the feel of wealth. It was an addiction for her. She was obsessed with her wealthier and prettier cousins, and she studied them and mirrored their mannerisms. Then her family paid for her. She went to posh school where she met and mixed with the scion of other very, very wealthy and prominent families. And all the girls at school were amazed that Wallis, the most boyish looking and most unattractive girl in the school, managed to snag the most handsome fella at school and also the heir to a great fortune, a boy named Lloyd Tabb, was Wallace's secret? She researched her prey. She knew everything about him, his favorite sport, all his hobbies. Even if they didn't interest her, she studied everything. She knew his favorite ice cream. She knew his scores at all the games he played. She built up his ego. She would touch his biceps. At the time when this was considered improper, she charmed his family and his friends, pretended to enjoy their singing. Um, she just charmed them really, really well. She transferred to the most expensive girls' school in Maryland, and all her best friends were heiresses. She spent holidays with them. All her best friends were people like the DuPonts, the Kinsolving, and the Kirks. They're all old money. And so she learned from them. She behaved like them. She and her friends all had crushes on the then 17-year-old Prince of Wales, Edward. They had pictures of him in their rooms at boarding school. They read magazines about him. She started getting bored with school when she was a teenager, around 16, 17, and started thinking about getting married. And luckily, at age 18, she'll get a chance to meet lots of the very, very rich prospects. Because, of course, they used to have society debutante balls back then where you get presented to society. And so she got to attend the bachelor's cotillion, where she met all the heirs to the great fortunes. And, all the newest society girls were there as well. Her uncle gave her $20 to buy the dress that she wore to the cotillion. At that time, $20 was a huge amount of money. He could have bought her 30 dresses, but Wallis bought just one dress and was very, very beautiful. She dressed beautifully. She got the best looking of her male cousins to accompany her and be her escort to the cotillion ball. Their names were announced, and she had a cousin paraded around the ballroom. They danced all night. And after that night, she went on date after date after date with all the most, all the best of the best. She just loved guys. And she had more boyfriends than any of the other society girls in Baltimore, which people found very strange due to, her looks. Because, she wasn't considered the most beautiful amongst the women in Baltimore society. And her grandmother died. She loved men in uniform. Her grandmother died and left her $4,000. And Wallis took her inheritance and went off to Florida and to the Naval Aeronautics Center, which was surrounded by men in uniform. And that's where she met her first husband. It was, of course, Earl Winfield Spencer, called him Win, the very athletic, very popular, attractive Navy pilot. He was also bisexual and alcoholic, an alcoholic who had killed 2 children whilst drunk driving. Wallis didn't know this, but she would find out later. So they played golf, they went to the movies, they had lots of fun, fancy dinners and everything. He proposed to her, she accepted. His family had money and social connections. That was huge for her. She had a huge wedding because her parents were denied one. And like right from after the wedding on their honeymoon, she began to see his true colors. He drank heavily during their honeymoon and it continued throughout their marriage. It was a very miserable and unhappy marriage for her. In 1920, Edward, the Prince of Wales, was visiting America and he attended a luncheon where several officers where Wallis's husband worked were invited, but Wallis and her husband were not invited, probably due to his alcoholism. And so she only got to see him from very far, far, far away at a ball that he was attending. Marriage to Win was getting worse. He maltreated her physically and emotionally. He would lock her in the bathroom for hours. He had countless affairs. There had never before been a divorce in Wallis's family, and she came from an old money family. She discussed the prospect with her family, and they thought it was out of the question. He told her to stay married. But even her husband he didn't like her at all after they got married. And he actually just abandoned her. He told her he was far happier when he was away from her and with other women. And luckily for her, even though they were living separate lives, he got transferred to China. And so even though they were living separate lives, it was still kept hush hush. Wallis also felt abandoned in the marriage, so she had countless affairs. She fell head over heels in love with a man named Felipe Espil, an Argentinian who worked at the embassy. Ended up in a love triangle with him because he fell in love with somebody else. And in a fit of jealousy, Wallis actually clawed his face, and she became a laughing stock. And so she ran off to China to join her husband. She got to China, and she's rumored to have, learned some, quote, perverse practices at brothels in China. And of course, a dossier was kept of her. We'll get into that later. What she actually learned at the brothels was how to give some kind of Chinese massages, because she was trying to do whatever she could to keep her husband happy. It didn't work. He left her for a man in China. And so Wallis had countless other affairs. She actually got pregnant, and she terminated the pregnancy. And this ruined her chances of ever having kids again. She returned to the US to obtain an official divorce. And one of the men she dated around this time asked her to marry him after she got divorced, after her divorce went through. But she told him that from now on, if she ever married, it wasn't going to be for love. She was only going to ever marry for money from now on. Then she met her second husband, Ernest Simpson, at Christmas party in 1926, after her divorce. They hit it off immediately. And he was married, of course, when they met. And at the time they met, his wife was very ill and she'd been hospitalized. And Ernest's wife found out about their affair and she divorced him. She said that Wallis was very smart. She stole my husband while I was ill. Wallis wasn't in love with Ernest, but Ernest had money, he had connections. And so she married him, and then they moved to London together in 1928. And she took to London life immediately, to the social, life, the social circle. She'd married him not out of love, but out of apathy, but at least it was fun. And he moved in aristocratic circles. And he taught her all about European architecture and art. And Wallis religiously read everything she could about Edward, including the court circular. She read all his speeches. She kind of stalked him. She even found out about his affair with Thelma Furness before it was public knowledge. And people didn't really know about it at the time because, of course, it was very, very hush-hush. Wallis and Ernest lost all their money in the crash of 1929, but she continued to monitor Edward's movements, even his trip to Cape Town and to Kenya, where Thelma joined him on safari. She knew that he'd endured a bout of malaria while he was on tour, and he'd had a heavy cold. In 1930, some of Wallis's American friends moved to London, and they worked at the embassy. And so through them, she was able to meet and befriend Thelma Furness. And Wallis really cultivated this friendship. She and Thelma would regularly meet for lunch at the Ritz, and they enjoyed gossiping about other Americans and, of course, aristocrats in London. In January 1931, Thelma invited Wallis to her home for a weekend fox hunt, where Edward was going to be present. Of course, Wallis accepted. And before going there, Wallis spent a full day at the hairdressers, trying to get her hair perfectly done. I think another full day at the beauty parlor. But as the day came, the Saturday came, she developed a severe cold. And she also realized that she didn't know how to properly curtsy or how to properly address the Prince of Wales, whom she was going to meet there. But none of that mattered in the end. So now I'm going to play a little video and we'll hear Edward's account about how he first met Wallis. I ask that we please mute ourselves so that we do not.
Simpson and I first met over a weekend at the House of Friends near Melton Mowbray in Leicestershire.
She had a terrible cold and was not feeling or looking her best. Our first conversation was surprisingly stilted and banal. And it ranged from the lack of central heating in British country homes and the ruggedness of the British climate.
Mrs. Simpson had heard a song about the prince some time before.
I remember coming back from China. It was after the prince's trip to America. And there was this song then saying, I knew a girl who danced with the Prince of Wales.
Wallis Warfield Simpson had now been married to Ernest Simpson, her second husband, for 3 years. They lived in London, and that year Mrs. Simpson was presented at court.
I was struck by the grace of her carriage and the dignity of her movements.
After our first meeting, I didn't see him again until the following spring. Then we met occasionally in the houses of friends.
From the first, I looked upon her as the most independent woman I had ever met. And presently, the hope formed that one day I might be able to share my life with her. Just how, I did not know.
Okay, so we finally met that Saturday night. He said good evening and shook her hand. She curtsied. She liked him instantly. They all had supper that night. The next morning, she came downstairs, still sniffling into her hanky. And when she came downstairs, there was nobody, there weren't really people all around him. She saw him sitting at a table, chatting to one of his aides. And she went and sat down right next to him. And then the Prince of Wales said to her, "You must miss central heating, Mrs. Simpson." And then she responded, "To the contrary, sir, I like the cold houses of Britain. I'm sorry, sir, but you have disappointed me." And he was like, "In what way, Mrs. Simpson?" To which she responded, "Every American woman who has come to England is asked the same question. I had hoped for something more original from the Prince of Wales." Edward was hooked. She had studied him and she knew that he wanted to be dominated. He loved strong women. He liked being talked down to. He liked being confronted head on. And she was totally irreverent to him and he loved it. So after their meeting, Wallis was invited to get presented at court to the king and queen, because that was the only way she was ever going to meet Edward again. And after the weekend ended, everyone went home, but Wallis was consumed with the idea of meeting him again. She fired her chauffeur and her maid and upgraded them. She decided that her best chance of meeting him, of course, was being presented at court. And she started scheming and getting ready for that. It was very, very difficult for people who were divorced to get presented at court. But Wallis put herself through the rigorous process because she was meant to order all kinds of documents from the US stating that the reason she was divorced was due to her husband's cruelty, not because she had been unfaithful or anything. She ordered all the kinds of documents. She started bragging to her friends back in America about having met the Prince of Wales. And as word spread around, around the US and among her American friends in London, she started receiving more and more invitations from that set. Wallis's social ambition was ferocious and she was obsessive about climbing the social ladder. She worked Thelma Furness off really, really well, cultivated that friendship very, very well. She met Edward again at another party at Thelma's home, and her presentation at court had been approved by this time. She was over the moon. She tried to borrow a dress of Thelma's to wear to her presentation at court, but Thelma was shorter than she was, so she brought something else. She brought Thelma's fan and other accessories for the occasion where she'll be presented at court. And after being presented to the king and queen, she mingled with all the guests. This is how she dressed to her presentation at court. She mingled with the guests, but she was still keeping her eye on Edward, watching him very closely. She had this way of, watching him but feigning indifference, like she wasn't interested in him. And so she overheard everything he was saying. She kept, following him everywhere, but she did it casually. Overheard something he had said. And then later that night at an after party at Thelma's house, she challenged him about what he'd said. And this really piqued his interest, so much so that at the end of the party, when she and her husband Ernest were leaving, Edward offered to personally drive them home in his own car. So Wallis dismissed her chauffeur for the night, and Edward dropped them off at their home. And Ernest and Wallis invited him in for a nightcap, but he refused. But he said that he would do so at another time. And they didn't meet again for months after that. That was in January 1932 when Edward invited them to his home at Fort Belvedere. By this time, Wallis and her husband were so broke, they didn't even have a car anymore because they've been trying to keep up with, the other wealthy friends. They had to borrow a car to drive to his castle. And Edward personally welcomed them at the door wearing a kilt. He was very, very laid back. A few of his other guests were there. They had dinner, they played cards and jigsaw puzzles, and they danced. And that was the first time he danced together with Wallis cheek to cheek. After that night, a friend invited Wallis and her husband to Tunisia on an all expenses paid trip. They had no money, so of course the friends paid for everything. They went on the trip, and after that, Wallis's auntie Bessie, and back in America, came to England, and she took them on another trip all over Europe. But Wallis was counting the days until the next time she would see Edward. She became very, very jealous when she found out that Edward was casually dating Amelia Earhart because he was obsessed with flying. And he started treating Thelma very, very badly around this time when he was involved with Amelia Earhart. Also went on public dates with a succession of other prominent women. He also went on his own trip around Europe, and he even dated Princess Ingrid of Sweden. Then when he got back to the UK, he invited the Simpsons to his home again. Edward and Thelma were closer than ever again, and Wallis was very, very shocked to see this. They were even doing embroidery together. Wallis was really, really annoyed because she thought, that this was her chance to get in. But, well, she wrote a letter to her Aunt Bessie complaining bitterly about it. And after this visit, Wallis traveled to the US to visit her aunt. And when she was on the ship about to sail to the US, she received a macronigram from Edward wishing her bon voyage. And so she knew that she had made headway with him because he didn't do this sort of thing often unless he really liked you. She returned to England and she was hosting friends at her home one afternoon. Even Thelma Furness was at Wallis's home having lunch. And then suddenly the doors burst open and Wallis's maid walked in and announced that Edward, the Prince of Wales, had sent his car to pick Wallis and take her over to his home at Fort Belvedere immediately. Wallis didn't say a word. She just got up. She put on her coat, picked up her handbag, and went out of the car. Her husband had tears in his eyes, and Thelma was stunned into silence. She couldn't even speak. So Wallis and Edward developed a, shall we say, colorful relationship that involved role playing with her as a nanny and involved foot fetish and diapers. But this isn't that type of event, so we're not going to discuss that. If you want to read more about it, you can read the book. So this was also the year that Hitler rose to power in Germany. And Edward was very, very pro-Germany because his family was German, and he was pro-Hitler. And so he was thrilled about Hitler's rise to power. And he felt that Germany's internal affairs were Germany's business. And Wallis was also all in with Hitler because of Edward. And so they never wavered in their support of Hitler because it was what he wanted. So in December 1933, Thelma decided that she was going to return to the US in January of 1934 to see her sister, who was having issues and fighting for custody of her daughter. And so Wallis took Thelma out for a farewell lunch at the Ritz. And she was, complaining, oh God, what's going to happen with Edward while she's away? And Wallis said, oh, Thelma, the little man is going to be so lonely without you. And Thelma she had a massive ego. She just didn't see Wallis as a threat because she thought her hold on Edward was so strong that, no one could come between them. And so she responded, well, dear, look after him while I'm away. See that he doesn't get into any mischief. And so Thelma left, and Edward was furious with Thelma for leaving because he felt abandoned. He was very, very needy. And she was leaving him for 6 weeks. Anyway, the day after Thelma left, Edward invited the Simpsons to a dinner party at his home. And after that party, at that party, Wallis was extremely attentive to him, hanging on his every word and pretending to care about everything he was talking about. But he was talking about the plight of the poor. Wallis didn't care about the poor. Anyway, he started calling the Simpson homes obsessively, even as late as 4 a.m., just to talk because he had insomnia. He had been alone and he was bored. And Wallis kept him entertained while Thelma was away. And his incessant calls drove Ernest crazy because Ernest was still working and he'd have to wake up, at 8 to go to work in the morning. And then this guy was calling their home 1 a.m., 2 a.m., waking them up in the middle of the night. He would show up at their home unannounced. And by this time, Wallis began to see that he was totally dependent on her already. She had the upper hand. And so she took advantage of the situation, kept him entertained, made him laugh, took him clubbing, personally cooked his meals. While Thelma was away, she had an affair with Prince Ali Khan. And this happened when she was sailing back to England. So on the ship when she was sailing back to London, she arrived back in London looking 10 years younger and glowing from her affair. I don't know how she didn't think that Edward had spies watching her throughout the trip. So he knew everything that happened. And he was furious with her. Even though he had all his other affairs, he was very, very angry at her. Not just because she had an affair, but because she had an affair with an Indian. It wounded his pride. I guess he was allowed to have affairs, but she belonged to him. And so when she came back, Edward was being very, very cold to her. And she foolishly went to cry on Wallis's shoulders and to get womanly advice from Wallis. So Thelma poured her heart out to Wallis and confessed to her affair and everything. And Wallis responded, but Thelma, the little man loves you so very much. He was so lost without you. And as they were there talking in Wallis's bedroom, Wallis's maid walked into the bedroom and told Wallis, the Prince of Wales is on the phone. Thelma was stunned. And Wallis went to answer the phone. And while they're talking, she told him, Thelma is here. I don't know how Thelma didn't see the warning signs from this time on. The following weekend, Eddie invited the Simpsons to his home again. And Thelma was there, but he was very, very cold to her. And he was barely said a word to her. He was very attentive and affectionate to Wallis. And after dinner that night, Edward picked a lettuce leaf from his plate and he was nibbling on it playfully. And then Wallis slapped his hand and told him, stop that, use a fork and a knife. And he smiled and blushed like a little boy. And that was when Thelma knew that it was over. Like, despite all the other warning signs, this is when she realized what had happened. And she looked at Wallis, and Wallis just stared her down and smirked. So she just left the dinner table and went to bed. And then while she was sleeping in bed, because she was devastated, Edward came and poked his head in through the door, and Thelma asked him, "Darling, is it Wallis?" He just went, "Don't be silly." And then he shut the door and he just left her there. And that night, Wallis went into the kitchen at his home and prepared a plate of scrambled eggs for him. And Edward was looking for her all over the house, all over his home. Then he walked into the kitchen and saw that she was scrambling eggs. And he sat down there in the kitchen, right in front of all his staff, and ate the eggs on the spot. The staff, they were all stunned. Summer left the next morning. She came back one last time to try and see Edward and see if they could fix things. But she walked in and found them in bed together. And so she left again. Wallis reveled in her new position. Her financial worries dissolved overnight. Remember, she and her husband had lost all their money during the financial crash of 1929. Her husband's finances picked up because Edward opened the doors for him to get initiated into his Masonic lodge, which granted him entry into all Edward's rich friends and business associates. All kinds of doors to the upper crust aristocrats swung wide open to Wallis and Ernest. While Wallis queened it up in London, she and her new friends enjoyed going to see all sorts of operas. They especially went to see Hitler's favorite opera by Wagner. She really enjoyed her new position. She went to all sorts of places that she couldn't have even dreamed of before. At this time, even Wallis's dressmaker in London was a Nazi agent. He started taking very good care of her, buying her expensive gifts. Wallis and Edward adored Hitler, but they also adored Mussolini. And Edward was actually planning to, he thought it would be good to have a dictatorship in the UK as well. And it's very telling that some of the first people that Edward introduced Wallis to were the German and Italian ambassadors in London. And just as he was devoted to Hitler, Hitler was similarly devoted to Edward and to the British aristocracy. He ensured that no expenses were spared in entertaining British aristocrats. The German ambassador was the best funded in all of Britain. He ensured that no expense was spared in entertaining them at dinners, at balls, and whatnot. In fact, despite the Nazi distaste towards gypsies, the German ambassador would invite Edward to the embassy residence for dinners or parties or to events, and he would always hire gypsy bands to play and perform because he knew that Edward and Wallis enjoyed their music. It was at one of these occasions that Wallis met Joachim von Ribbentrop, her rumored lover. Hitler liked Wallis very much, and he actually used to play videos of her back at his hunting lodge, and even Eva Braun adored her. Wallis was ruthless in getting rid of the competition. She made sure Edward cut off all contact with his former mistresses. She took control of all his staff at all his homes. She drew up menus for every day of the week at all his homes, even though she was only there on weekends. She decorated all his homes and removed all traces of her past rivals. She fired old loyal staff who had been with him since childhood and replaced them with her own loyalists. The remaining staff despised her. She and Edward would go clubbing and come back around 3 a.m. and 4 a.m. and wake them up and get them to cook elaborate meals for them. In the summer of 1934, Edward took Wallis on holiday to Spain and France without her husband. Her Aunt Bessie came along as a chaperone. She just came along on holiday. She didn't chaperone anything. Wallis was terrified of flying because she'd witnessed a few plane crashes, so she went by ship. On August 6th, while they were on August 5th, while they were on a holiday, they were enjoying drinks by a pool in Barretts in France when a 10-year-old boy fell into the deep end of the pool and started drowning. And so Edward jumped into the pool and saved the boy. And of course, news spread far and wide that the Prince of Wales had saved a young boy who was drowning in the pool. And guess who came running over? The paparazzi. It was a big thing, of course. The paparazzi came round to report on the Prince of Wales saving this child who had drowned. And Edward was very, very annoyed because he didn't want to be photographed with Wallis because she was married and her husband wasn't there. But when Wallis left the club immediately, and the pictures appeared in newspapers all over the world the next day. And so Edward and Wallis went into hiding for a little bit. They sailed on a vessel to Portugal, to Mallorca, to Gibraltar, and Wallis was too terrified of flying, and so that's why they went on ship. There was a huge storm there. They went to Cannes and they checked into a hotel together. And while Wallis was asleep at the hotel, Edward woke up around 1 a.m. And summoned the hotel's night manager and got the night manager to wake up all the staff at the hotel that worked at the Cartier shop that was attached to the hotel and instruct them to go to the Cartier shop. And they all went there. Then Edward snuck into the shop and picked up an emerald and diamond charm bracelet for Wallis and dozens of other gifts that he would continue giving her over the course of their relationship. He returned to the hotel and woke Wallis and the rest of his staff up, and then they continued on their trip that night. They sailed to Nice, to Genoa, to Lake Como. And it was during this trip that his obsession to Wallis became hyper. He was intensely in love with her. Unfortunately, it wasn't mutual because to her, it was just a means to an end. She was just enjoying what she could get from him. In November, Edward's youngest brother, George, was set to get married to Princess Marina of Greece. And the family was thrilled because George and Edward were considered to be very, very wayward. George had secretly dated a Black actress for years. And so the family was relieved that he was moving on from that. George was also rumored to have had a son out of wedlock and to have dated a young French boy. The family was very happy that at least one of their wayward sons was settling down. King George and Queen Mary had banned Wallis from the wedding because, of course, the paparazzi had announced their involvement together and the family knew now. Well, Edward smuggled her into the palace anyway, and she didn't just attend the wedding and the reception. She was determined to upstage the bride, and she did at the wedding. Edward forced his parents to meet her. They iced her, and so did the rest of the guests. They didn't care. They danced the night away at the wedding. Wallis was starting to tire of Edward's clinginess and his obsessive phone calls and visits, even though she enjoyed being known as his girl and she loved antagonizing his family and everything. And then in 1935, in January 1935, Wallis made a big mistake that would come to haunt her. Now, Edward's younger brother, Albert, Bertie, had married Elizabeth. Now, Bertie's wife had a very, very high-pitched voice, and Wallis found the voice very, very annoying. And so when Bertie's wife wasn't around, Wallis would mock her voice and, imitate her to entertain guests and everything. Well, one night, while they were at Edward's home, Elizabeth walked in and caught Wallis imitating her voice in front of all the other guests. She was just stunned to see this, and she never, ever forgave Wallis for it. Then Wallis had total power over Edward, and she wielded it. He loved women who were rude, rude to him, and Wallis did it all the time. She loved being rude to him in front of everybody. His parents told him not to bring her to their Jubilee ball. He brought her anyway and danced with her. And then she wanted to make sure that she watched the Jubilee ceremony, which she'd been banned from. And Edward got her to attend because he told one of his friends to bring her in. He told one of his friends that he was sending some of his maids over to watch the parade from their balcony. And the maid that showed up was Wallis Simpson. Wallis and Edward went on numerous vacations around Europe. But while on these vacations, they would secretly meet and continue building alliances with prominent Nazis. Edward even sent a speech in perfect German that was read at a Nazi ceremony. And his speech received a standing ovation. And one of the leaders of the Reich League actually said afterwards, "The Prince of Wales is the man of the moment, not only in his own country, but throughout Germany. Heil Hitler." And when King George, Edward's father, heard about it, he was livid. Because first of all, the royal family was meant to stay out of politics and not to engage in political discourse publicly. But Edward didn't care. And he was very, very defiant. He was very stressed by everything that was happening. And he began to rely on Wallis even more and more. But Wallis was starting to get ambivalent, and she just stayed ambiguous towards him, really. She liked the proximity and the benefits that being near him, because being close to royalty provided her lots of benefits. She received money, she received jewels, she went on holiday, public attention and admiration, and she was able to break rules and flout convention and get away with it. But around the same time, she wrote a letter to her Aunt Bessie in which she categorically stated that she was not in love with Edward. In fact, Wallis and her husband referred to Edward as Peter Pan, and she was very, very distressed by his infantile dependence on her. But she's the one who had engineered everything. She wanted to have a loyal husband and also have a slavishly devoted prince, plus respectability and notoriety. She wanted to have privacy and social prominence at the same time. She just wanted to have it all, and it was becoming an impossible situation. Edward, on the other hand, was taking her even more seriously. He began to include her in his high-level meetings with heads of state. And this was around this time that Wallis decided to create her signature wardrobe, because at one point she was considered the best dressed woman in the world. So while Edward was getting ready, preparing to make her queen, basically, she was preparing, just preparing her own wardrobe. She was just preparing her wardrobe and taking advantage of what she could get. So now I'm going to play a video about her influence on the fashion world at that time. And I ask that we please mute ourselves so we don't disrupt. Thank you.
Wallis Simpson said, "I knew I could never be the most beautiful woman in the world, but I knew I could be the best dressed woman in the world," and she was. The way she wore her hair and the way she dressed was copied by everyone. Even my grandmother used to wear her hair the same way as the Duchess of Windsor. She never changed it. Parted in the middle, dark, chignon at the back. She is said to have had her hair dressed 3 times a day. There was not a hair out of place. There was not a crooked line to the hairline. The Duchess of Windsor was built well for clothes. Wide shoulder, again, narrow hips, small bosom. She spent huge amounts of money on her clothes and on her jewelry. This fashion editor friend of mine said that a big event every now and then was the Duchess of Windsor selling her hand-me-downs. The clothes had a special cachet because they had belonged to her. Anything that the Duchess ever wore was automatically chic. A king abdicated his throne for a plain-looking American divorcee. It's only happened once. It seems so inconceivable that she held the Duke of Windsor in her power that people imagine there must be some reason. I mean, we don't have the answer to that, but certainly her style was a part of it. If you grew up at a certain time in America or in the world, the Duchess of Windsor was the most untouchably glamorous woman associated with one of the most romantic stories of all time.
So in the autumn of 1935, King George was very ill, and being king was getting burdensome for him. But the thought of what Edward and Wallis will do after his death just bothered him the most. Edward's parents hated Wallis and Thelma, but they actually came to respect Frida Dudley Ward, the one they refer to as the lacemaker's daughter. They now came to respect her. She was the most respectable of them all in his parents' eyes. So his parents prayed that Edward would never marry and have children, and they prayed that nothing would ever come between Bertie and Elizabeth, so that their marriage would work out and the crown would pass to them and to their children. Edward's father predicted that Edward would not last 1 year as king before he ruined everything. He was right. King George authorized Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin to begin digging into Wallis's past. And this was how the infamous China dossier came about. They hoped to use it to prevent Wallis from ever becoming queen or even from ever marrying Edward. Edward himself even thought his brother Bertie would make a better king than he would, and he privately called his sister-in-law Queen Elizabeth. He never wanted to be king. January 1936, King George was gravely ill and dying, and he went into a coma. And he went into a coma on the 19th of January around 11 p.m. And Lord Dawson injected him with morphia and a gram of cocaine to speed up his death, just so that it could make the morning newspapers. It's ridiculous. It took him 15 minutes to die. The nurse who was looking after him refused to inject him, so that's why Lord Dawson had to do it himself. Edward sobbed uncontrollably. He was at his father's bedside. He sobbed uncontrollably. His mother remained stoic and composed. Throughout the rest of the night, and the following day, he called Wallis so much that she started getting irritated with him. That didn't stop her from attending the official proclamation ceremony to announce him as the new king. It was, of course, King Edward VIII. And when the ceremony was over, he dropped Wallis at her home and drove over to Sandringham, where the will was read. And he was stunned to discover that his siblings inherited most of the money. He was incandescent with rage that he had the equivalent of what would be $100 million today, plus the palace and the castles, and he was king. But his parents had just not left money to him. They left it to his siblings. So Edward threw tantrums throughout the reading of the will and in the following days, and many of the royal staff were reluctant to work for him because they were witnessing his outbursts and they couldn't believe that this was the new monarch. One of his first acts as king was to order that the exact copy of the royal Buick that he was driven around in, along with the royal insignia and license plates, be manufactured for Wallis. You cannot imagine the amount of anger behind palace walls when he did this. The car was made for her, and it's what she was driven around in from that day on. Wallis even told him what to wear to his father's funeral, and he obeyed her. Wallis told him how to handle the royal budget. They made radical changes to the palaces together, from staff uniforms to their work hours. Now, the staff were expected to be at their beck and call, no matter the hour. Wallis even made plans to remodel and modernize Buckingham Palace. Fortunately, he was off the throne before these could come into effect. Wallis wrote to her aunt that she was, quote, laughing a lot on the inside around this time. Also said that even if Edward married someone of appropriate background, she, Wallis, would never relinquish her power over him. Even now, nothing in her letters to her aunt hinted that she had any affection toward Edward. In her letters to him, she sounds like she loves him, but it's nothing compared to the slavish devotion in the letters that Edward was writing to her. She was just coldly calculating how to, further her power now that she had the king of an empire under her control. She asked him for today's equivalent of £1.5 million, and she got it. In February 1936, Ernest supposedly visited Edward and asked him if he wanted to marry Wallis, because he was starting to tire of the whole situation. You can only take so much of, sharing your wife with someone else. And Wallis had introduced her husband Ernest to a friend of hers named Mary Raffray to take care of him. And how ironic, but Mary did to Wallis what Wallis had done to Thelma, because Mary took very, very good care of Ernest, and Ernest fell in love with her, and now he wanted a divorce. And so he began to collude with Edward to divorce Wallis. And Wallis found out, and she was very, very unhappy about it. She felt betrayed by Mary. How could her friend do that to her? How could her friend betray her the way she betrayed Thelma Furness? And even though Wallis was unhappy about her impending divorce, Edward saw it as an opportunity to obtain her divorce so he could marry her. And around this time, the four of them spent a lot of weekends together at Edward's home, just to avoid having any rumors. And Edward, being king, he was able to keep his relationship with Wallis quiet, because he ordered the British press not to say anything about it. Wallis was getting bolder by the day, and believed that she began to have an affair with Ribbentrop around this time, and that he was paying her on Hitler's behalf to read Edward's official state papers from the red box that monarchs are given, and to pass along the information. She ordered her spring wardrobe, and Edward bought her lots of fabulous jewels. She threw a party on April 2nd at her home, and invited other women who she knew had designs on Edward to the party. She seemed to have a perverse thrill from showing off her power to other women that were within his circle, or women that she knew wanted him. Anyway, during the party, Wallis had strolled outside, and so when she walked back into the house, her shoes were muddy. And right in front of everyone at the party, she commanded Edward, "Take off my dirty little shoes and bring me another pair." And Edward knelt down right there, took off her shoes in front of everybody, and went and brought her a new pair of shoes. And he was smiling and blushing. He was so happy. But this was just a way of showing off her power, to all the other women who were there. She loved having all eyes on her and just showing off her power over him. On May 27th, Edward invited Prime Minister Baldwin to York House to meet his future wife. The Prime Minister was not impressed. He had seen the China dossier. Wallis wrote to her aunt that it was difficult having two men and trying to please both of them. She had outgrown Ernest and all right with leaving him, but she didn't want to marry Edward. She was content just being Edward's mistress, because other kings of England had had mistresses like Camilla Parker Bowles' great grandmother Alice Capel had been a mistress to the king, and they had a fabulous relationship until he died. And so she was all right with leaving Ernest, but she wanted to just, remain on as Edward's girlfriend. And if Edward got involved with another woman, she would lose her power over him, and she would no longer get any of the cars or the clothes or the jewels, and she wasn't going to let that go. Next. There was one newspaper that dared to publish a story about Wallis, just Wallis, not about her relationship with Edward or anything. It was the Cavalcade paper, wrote a story about her life, but all the copies were confiscated. And so only the foreign press wrote about her. Edward was supposed to mourn his dad for 12 months, but he changed the rules of mourning to allow for night clubbing and for public dining at restaurants, so that he and Wallis could keep going clubbing and going to dine at restaurants. They even went to Ascot, and the aristocracy, they were actually really, really angry with him for doing that. And he brought Wallis to Ascot. Not only that, she came in her royal buraq. The aristocrats were very, very annoyed with him, and some actually never forgave him for that. On July 16th, Edward was undertaking a military review in Hyde Park when there was an attempted assassination by a lone gunman. It's been found out recently that the Prime Minister and much of the Secret Service knew about the plot, but they did nothing to stop it. Anyway, the man was captured and arrested. Wallis and Edward traveled all over Europe again, now that he was king, and lots of newspapers have printed about their romance. And so whenever they went anywhere in Europe, people came out to see them in droves. People would be shouting, "Long live the king," or long live love." They had lots of support in Europe, and Wallis was enjoying her role as a surrogate queen, and Edward was happy to give her a foretaste of it. She even got to meet King George of Greece during an official dinner in Greece. Okay, and now during that official dinner in Greece, Wallis's dinner gown got caught under the foot of a chair, and Edward knelt down to get the hem of her dinner gown from under the foot of the chair. And instead of thanking him, Wallis said, "Well, that was the most extraordinary performance I've ever seen." She then went on a public tirade berating him in front of everybody, and he was smiling. He loved that kind of thing. Throughout their voyage, all the crews and people on the yachts they traveled on saw her pick on him incessantly and order him around publicly. He even went rowing one time and he fell into the water, and Wallis laughed hysterically at him. Like, he loved being humiliated by her. The trip ended. Wallis returned to England and moved out of her home, and she started working on her divorce. Edward moved her to Balmoral, and she stayed in the Queen's apartments, and all the staff there hated her as well. She got many of them fired and replaced. She Americanized the menu for guests who came for afternoon tea. Instead of getting traditional British sandwiches, they'd get a three-decker toasted club sandwiches. Very, very American. Back in London, she moved into a Regency house and began to remodel it to her own taste. Edward gave her £1 million worth of jewels and £50,000 worth of silver fox furs. He instructed the British press not to publish anything about her divorce. Even though she didn't want the divorce to Ernest, it happened anyway. And her divorce went through on October 27, 1936. She knew that if people found out, most of them would hate her because she'd seen how the aristocrats were turning on her and how all of Edward's staff hated her, and she was afraid of becoming queen. Anyway, after her divorce went through, even though it had not really been finalized because it was going to take some time, Edward called to congratulate her, and he proposed to her. She had asked for a Mogul emerald, which is supposedly a very, very rare stone. And Edward had contacted Cartier to get one made. It was no easy feat. They looked all over the world to find this rare jewel, and they found it in Baghdad, and they made the engagement ring. Edward proposed to her, gave her the ring. He also told Wallis that the Prime Minister had visited him and advised against her getting the divorce, but they went through with it anyway. But Wallis was very afraid because she knew the limits of her power. She knew she couldn't go toe to toe with the Prime Minister. He was, a whole different kettle of fish. She wanted to be single but remain as his mistress. Well, he was planning their wedding for June 8th of 1937. And the world's press had covered their story relentlessly, but the British public did not really know about it. This is about to change. In November 1936, Edward was informed that the British press was about to break their silence about Wallis, and he was told that the PM and several MPs were planning to resign and to dissolve Parliament if he went ahead and married Wallis. Wallis knew that there was serious backlash coming her way. She cried and begged Edward not to marry her, and he should find someone appropriate and marry, as she would stay on as his mistress. And he insisted that he was going to marry her anyway, even if he had to give up the throne. All this while, all these years they'd been together, about 5 years or something, Edward was blissfully unaware that all the courtiers, politicians, and churchmen, he was unaware of people that he and Wallis had offended, and people who had formed a powerful coalition to get him off the throne. They knew he was besotted with Wallis, and they saw her as a wonderful way out for them in all of this. His chief enemy was actually the Archbishop of Canterbury, a man named Cosmo Gordon Lang, whom wrote of Edward, "It was clear that he knew little. It's clear he knows little, and I fear cares little about the church." Edward had even refused to invite the Archbishop of Canterbury to meet with him after he was king. And so the Archbishop was very, very bitter about it. Now, PM Stanley Baldwin was very, very conservative. He respected tradition. And Edward was one they saw as too modern. And even in the press, he had enemies, even though they kept quiet. He had lots of enemies in the press as well. And they'd been spying on Edward for years. Even when he was Prince of Wales, even as a king, he was being spied on. It's remarkable. Meanwhile, his brother Albert, the Duke of York, had been approached privately and told that there was a very real possibility that Edward could be removed from the throne. And Bertie responded in a letter, quote, "If the worst happens and I have to take over, you can be assured that I will do my best to clear up this inevitable mess if the whole fabric doesn't crumble under the shock and strain of it all." And so now that they knew that his brother was willing, their plot to get him off the throne, it took only about 45 days. On October 26th, the Archbishop of Canterbury, Edward's private secretary, and the editor of the Times newspaper all secretly met to discuss what they could do. The Archbishop said that he could not bring himself to consecrate Edward as king during a coronation. And so they began plotting with all other people within the government about how to get him off the throne. And this plot involved the Prime Minister, the head of the civil service, members of the cabinet, and many others that were working behind the scenes and meeting privately. Edward did not know. It was a coup that was going on. Edward met with, he summoned the PM to Buckingham Palace on November 16th because he'd met with Winston Churchill, and Winston Churchill had suggested that he could get away with a morganatic marriage wherein he could marry Wallis, but she would not be queen. And so he summoned the prime minister to discuss this possibility. And the prime minister told Edward that he would have to consult with the members of the Commonwealth and find out what the public opinion was like and see if people agreed to it. And Edward threatened to relinquish the throne if he didn't get his way, expecting that the prime minister will back down. Meanwhile, the prime minister was doing cartwheels in his mind. He was like, he played right into their hands. And the prime minister told him that, you can keep Wallis on as a mistress and marry someone more appropriate. Edward insisted that he could not imagine his coronation without Wallis by his side as his queen. Played right into their hand. It was what they wanted if he was threatening to abandon his position as king. Because remember, they started this plot way back in 1927 before he even met Wallis. So Edward traveled to Wales on a tour, and he received an overwhelmingly positive reception from the people. It was as if the Beatles had come to town, and he saw that the common folk, really still adored him. He was as popular as Princess Diana. The people really, really adored him, and the prime minister saw this as a threat, because if he's a very, very popular king, and they get him off the throne and install his brother Bertie, who is going to, be their puppet, he'll do whatever they wanted, but they still had this powerful, charismatic king on the throne. There was going to be a problem. It still didn't deter them anyway. They worked even harder to get him off the throne. And so they consulted with the dominions. And then the prime minister came back and told Edward that the consensus had been unanimous, that the idea of a morganatic marriage was out of the question. This was a lie, because some of the nations had been very, very supportive of his marrying Wallis, and some had been on the fence. And a country like New Zealand was actually very much in support. They didn't care. But who was going to tell Edward? Who was going to show him the actual documents? So he was told that, sorry, that there's no chance that his marriage to Wallis would be accepted by the Commonwealth, and his only choice was to get off the throne. And actually, Prime Minister Baldwin asked Edward during their last meeting before he signed the abdication papers, quote, "If an archangel came down and asked you to change your mind, will it have any effect on your decision?" Edward responded, "Not in the slightest." The prime minister was overjoyed. But still, this was still going on behind the scenes. And then the Bishop of Bradford was the first person to publicly speak out against Edward and Wallis. He did so in a sermon. And after doing that, it was like he lit the fuse on the bomb. And then the British press went to town. The dam burst. All the things they'd gathered, all the pictures they'd gathered, everything they'd been gathering about Edward and Wallis for years was getting printed now. And the paparazzi followed her everywhere. She was being hounded. She couldn't even go out to do her hair because the press was on her doorstep. She couldn't do anything. She couldn't handle it. She loved attention and publicity, and now she couldn't handle it. She got more than she could handle. And surprisingly, all the letters that the newspapers were getting back, 90% of them actually supported Edward and Wallis, and they begged him not to abdicate. Of course, the newspaper editors didn't publish those ones. They published the ones that didn't support him, because most of the people wanted him to remain king. They didn't know about his Nazi sympathies and other, unsavory dealings. Winston Churchill even tried to stand up for Edward VIII during the meeting in Parliament where they were going to discuss his abdication, but he got shouted down and humiliated. It was the most shattering experience of his entire career. He never recovered from it. Anyway, after the PM's final meeting with Edward, where Edward said that he wasn't going to change his mind, he was going to marry Wallis and abdicate, the PM left in his car and he told his secretary, quote, "This is making history. This is what I like." And on December 10th, Edward signed the instrument of abdication and the document renouncing forever his claim to the British throne. And the country was in shock. Even, Wallis went through hell. She received death threats. There was a brick that was thrown through her neighbor's window one night and it woke her up. Her nerves were jangled. She almost had a nervous breakdown. Her friends stopped calling her. She cried constantly. She upped the insurance on her jewels and she wrote her will, leaving all her possessions to her Aunt Bessie. She even considered fleeing to the US until after his coronation, and she was willing to let him marry somebody else, but Edward vowed that even if she ran away anywhere in the world, he would find her. He threatened to kill himself if she ever left him. His obsession with her just never, ever wavered. That didn't make things any easier for her. She had a very, very difficult time. She had to sneak out of restaurants through bathroom windows. And when she was driving in her car, she had to lie down on the floor of her car and behave in a very, very undignified way to, escape the paparazzi and the public glare. She had to sneak out of Britain in a car. She wanted to run away, actually, at that time, run away to France and run away from Edward. But he sent his bodyguards to take her to France. She hid on the floor of the car with blankets covering her to escape the paparazzi and people who were following them. And this is a woman who, came from a very, very prominent Baltimore family, very wealthy family. She had, if you can believe it, she had better breeding than Princess Grace of Monaco. Even though her mother was poor, that's the kind of family background she had. And she was having to do this sort of thing. And she was crying on her sofa as she heard Edward giving his abdication speech. She was crying down on her sofa under heavy blankets. The nation was in utter shock after his abdication. His title was now the Duke of Windsor, and his shy, frail, sickly, timid younger brother who had zero charisma was proclaimed king, George VI. The family was furious at him. They were very, very furious because they never wanted it. And now Wallis was trapped. And she was like an insect trapped in a spider web. And it was partly her doing, because it was her unbridled ambition, greed, and arrogance that had backfired on her. And now there was no way out. And there's a series of 15 letters that were discovered in an English attic a few years ago. I will leave a link to the documentary that I watched about those letters that she wrote to her ex-husband Ernest at this time when Edward was fighting to marry her and abdicating for her. She was writing letters to Ernest. She really regretted everything. She regretted her divorce to him. She wrote a series of love letters to him. She misses the good old simple days they had. And now she's stuck here, just looking at the graveyard of all that was them. She had gotten out. She had found a way to get out. She would have gotten away. There was just no way out. The paparazzi followed her even to her home in France, where she was hiding. She couldn't go out to do any of the things she had done before. And then Edward moved her to another of the villas in France, and she was heavily guarded there. So even if she wanted to escape at this time, she had no way to get away. She wrote a letter to the British government to inform them that she had zero intention of marrying Edward. There was nothing she could have done that would have made them stop, because Wallis was essential to their plan of getting rid of Edward. She was a dream come true for them. They could have thanked her if they could. But for her, marrying Edward was like a life sentence. Because I mean, fawning at adoration is fine, right? In the beginning, when you meet someone and they're all over you, it's fine. But it gets tiring. The novelty wears off, and then she was stuck with a man child for the rest of her life, and it was no fun. In fact, in one of the letters she wrote to her ex-husband, she described her upcoming wedding as, quote, the new Peter Pan plan. Does that sound like a woman who was in love? She yearned for her old life with her ex, Ernest. Ernest was meant to be her security blanket, and now she was gone. She was very, very lonely. She was trapped. She was receiving hate mail, death threats. It was a very, very miserable time for her. Edward left 2 days after the abdication on the 12th of December on the cover of night, and he went to Austria to wait for the storm to blow over. Their intention was always to return, to England and live the rest of their lives at his home, in his private home at Fort Belvedere. But he did not understand the impact of his abdication on both his family and on the country, because it was seen as a huge betrayal. And from Austria, he kept calling his brother Bertie to, give unsolicited advice on, how to run the country as king. Those calls were not welcomed or appreciated. George VI was crowned, of course, on May 12, 1937. And Edward wasn't allowed to attend the coronation. I don't think he'd have wanted to. Wallis was very, very lonely in France. And so they were getting ready for their marriage, for their wedding in June. Edward sent her their dog named Slippers to keep her company. And the dog arrived in the morning. And then that evening, Wallis took their dog Slippers for a walk, and Slippers got bitten by a viper and died. And they both wept, because that was one of the only things that gave them comfort around this time. The wedding was, of course, on June 8th, 1937. No one from his family came. There were only 12 guests at his wedding. And then just after the wedding ceremony, he was informed that Wallis had been denied the title of Her Royal Highness. He burst into tears. It shattered him, and he never, ever forgave his family for that. It was something he just couldn't ever get over it. And then after the wedding, during the reception, Edward's aide took Wallis aside and told her, quote, everybody hates you because you've taken and married our beloved king. But if you make him happy, people will forgive you and things will change. And so Wallis knew the heavy responsibility she had. She had no other choice but to stay married to him and to keep him happy. The abdication caused them so much pain that they agreed during their honeymoon that they would never speak of it again. They simply referred to it as 1936. Wallis did everything within her power throughout their marriage to keep him happy. And sometimes keeping him happy involved being rude to him in public and being nasty to him because he liked it. It's some men like it. Some very, very powerful men like it, like being put down or being punished. It's sadomasochistic. And so for the next 35 years, she was his mother, his nurse, and his wife until the day he died. Because he was a very, very infantile person. He behaved like a teenage boy, and she had to stay whether she liked it or not. And his family was horrid to them, because Wallis, remember, had offended Elizabeth, who was now a queen consort, right, by mocking her voice. And now she had the power to deal with Wallis, and she did, and dealt with Wallis, and by extension Edward, for making her husband become king. Wallis was excluded from everything. Queen Mary refused to ever meet with Wallis. as Edward's mom refused to ever meet Edward's wife. And even Edward wasn't even invited to the unveiling of his father's statue, even though he paid half the cost of it. He wasn't even told about it until he read about it in a newspaper. He was livid. Edward was supposed to receive the equivalent of he was supposed to receive £25,000 a year, the equivalent of £250,000 today from Parliament, and they refused to ever pay him the money. He agreed to sell Balmoral and Sandringham to his palaces to his brother because he'd inherited them. But even this turned into a long, drawn-out battle. It took a very, very long time to get it sold to him, and he didn't get much money for it. And he was informed that he couldn't return to live in the UK as a former king because there can't be two kings in one country. And so that's where their dream of ever going back to live there went, because he'd actually sent the body of their dead dog Slippers to be buried there. They always had the intention of moving back to live in the UK. That was his home. And now the novelty of being married soon wore off, and he was bored and alienated. And Wallis had the unenviable task of keeping him entertained constantly. It was exhausting. And now they didn't have the luxury of, the unlimited wealth and power they had before when he was Prince of Wales and king. And he always thought they were going to move back to England, so much so that for 16 years, he refused to buy any property in France. He refused to learn a word of French. To him, there were two languages, English and foreign was German. So imagine how it was when he was speaking German to people in France. He was expecting to be offered a job, and it wasn't forthcoming. His family was treating him very, very badly. And so in 1937, when Hitler invited the couple to Germany, he accepted the invitation on the condition. He asked them, "Will you courtesy to my wife? Will you refer to her as Her Royal Highness?" And they agreed. And so he naively thought that he could stop Hitler from going to war. He was very, very naive, and become the hero of the day. And also, it was the closest thing that Wallis ever got to a royal tour as queen. And so he accepted, and they went to Germany on the invitation of Hitler and the Nazis. And of course, this backfired on him. When they met with Hitler, Hitler refused to speak German with him. And Edward tried to beg Hitler not to go to war, but it had no impact at all. And of course, they went on to war. Edward adored Wallis even throughout their time in exile together in France. In fact, wherever they lived, every time Wallis was leaving the house for a hair appointment, remember she did her hair 3 times a day, right? Wherever she was going, she was about to leave the house, an aide would call Edward and tell him the Duchess is heading out. Edward would then head downstairs and be waiting for her at the bottom of the stairs. And then when she came downstairs, he would walk her to the door and tell her, "Hurry back, my darling, I shall miss you." On her way back, as her car was approaching the gates, Edward would be told that the Duchess was on her way back in. He would meet her back at the door to welcome her back. He did this for 35 years. It's inconceivable the way he loved her. She never once left the house or ever came back to the house without this happening for the rest of his life till he died. Of course, it wasn't, she didn't love him that much, but she learned to love him. She took care of him to the best of her ability. Even towards the end of his life, when he was in a wheelchair, he would go down in the lift and still do this. Wallis tried to get him reconciled with his family. She wrote to Queen Mary begging that he is your son. Forgive him, he is your son. Even if you hate me, this is your son. I know you miss him. Please let him come back and all that. But, It never happened, even till Queen Mary, even till Queen Mary's death. When World War II broke out, Edward and Wallis fled from France to Spain. In fact, when they got to the border, they were even denied visas to enter Spain until Edward called the ambassador, in the English ambassador in Spain, to obtain visas for them, because he wanted to return to England. And in fact, while they were in Spain, he was ordered to come back to England, but he tried to use it to negotiate. He said he wasn't going to go back unless he was given a proper job and his wife was accepted by the rest of his family. And they weren't going to do that. So they moved on from Spain to Lisbon. And while they were in Lisbon, he received a telegram that he'd been offered the position as governor of the Bahamas. And so while they're waiting for their boat to leave for the Bahamas, they were surrounded by spies, German spies, English spies, Spanish spies, like spies from all over Europe were watching them, unbeknownst to them. They hated life in the Bahamas, but they did it with distinction anyway. They carried on, and the marriage was very, very draining for Wallis, but she soldiered on. And when his brother Bertie, George VI, died, of course, Wallis was not allowed to come back for the funeral, and Edward was very, very bitter about it. Like his wife wasn't allowed to even attend his brother's funeral. She wasn't allowed to attend his mom's funeral either. Then Elizabeth II, the current Queen of England, became the Queen. Things with his family remained pretty much the same at first. It took 29 years into their marriage before Queen Elizabeth, tried to make peace. She called them on the phone. She got to meet Wallis. Wallis was allowed to, Wallis was allowed to attend the unveiling of the memorial to Edward's mom's statue. And then after this time, when the family began to reconcile, Edward, of course, developed cancer, and the Queen visited him in hospital and saw him and saw Wallis as well. And then just as he was dying, apparently when people know that they're when people are about to die, sometimes they know it, they sense it, and they send their loved ones away from them, sort of a way to give them permission to die. And so Edward, I guess, sensed that he was dying, and so he made Wallis go to bed. He told her she looked tired and she should go to bed. And then she went to bed, and while she was sleeping, he died. And she was awakened around 3 a.m. and informed of his death. He died at age 78 in 1972. And she, of course, came to his bedside, and she was so shocked. She couldn't even cry. She just sat by his bedside. My David, my David, my David. She was devastated. She'd grown to love him. Like for 35 years, they only had each other. Even if she hadn't loved him at first, she grew to. They were, a pair. They'd weathered lots of storms together. She attended his funeral in London as well, of course, and then returned to France. But she was just never the same after he died. She withdrew. She became a complete recluse. She refused to see anybody. The next 17 years of her life, she was very miserable. She developed Alzheimer's. And when people came to see her, she'd say things like, David is upstairs writing a letter, but he'll be with you shortly. She forgot that he'd even died. She was really miserable. She just had a decline, and she was bedridden until she died. She never recovered. And she died in 1986. And now, after Edward/David had died, she was standing by his graveside with Queen Elizabeth. And Queen Elizabeth asked her if she wanted to be buried on the left or right side of Edward's grave. And she chose to be buried on the right side because there were these big trees around there, and she knew how hated she was. and she thought that nobody would ever go to her grave to leave any flowers. But she thought at least in the autumn, when the leaves were falling, at least the leaves would fall onto her grave, and those would be the flowers that she got. And so, well, when she died, she was buried at Frogmore near Windsor Castle next to him. He wasn't buried beside all the other kings where he was supposed to have been buried. So when we ask the question, was it a great love match? Yes and no, because Edward was besotted with her from the very beginning. It never ever wavered. His obsession never ever wavered. She was just using him at first. She enjoyed the perks of being with him. Things got out of hand. And after she was forced to marry him and make it work, she had no choice but to give it her best and to love him in her own way. And it had a very tragic ending, but I think, yes, in her own way, Wallis did love him in